I never believed that a single piece of paper could change the course of a man's life, but when I unfolded the yellow deed my uncle left me, I felt the weight of it like a stone in my chest. I had been told for years that the old cabin in the mountains was nothing more than a rotting shell, abandoned since Uncle Henry's death. Lawyers had called it worthless land, good for nothing except a few stunted pine trees and the memories of a man who never had children of his own. I went up there expecting dust, silence, and the ghosts of my family's past. What I found instead were 5 living, breathing reminders that my uncle had secrets far greater than any lawyer had whispered about. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cabin itself, but the smoke, thin, grey, and rising steady into the morning sky. My horse shifted beneath me as I stared up the slope. That cabin should have been empty. No one was supposed to be there. The chimney was cracked when I last saw it as a boy, yet now it worked just fine, carrying wood smoke into the crisp air. My boots crunched on frost as I dismounted, every step pulling me closer to something I could not explain. I expected maybe squatters, drifters, or even a trespassing trapper passing through. What I didn't expect was the sound of laughter, a woman's laughter, ringing clear and full of life. It cut through the silence of the mountains like a bell, pulling me forward despite every warning thought that told me to turn back. I should have been cautious, but curiosity has always been my weakness. I crept closer, the cold air stinging my lungs, until the windows of the cabin glowed warm with lamplight. Shadows moved behind those curtains, graceful and deliberate. The scent of cooking drifted on the air, herbs and fresh bread mingling with the pine. That place, which should have been a ruin, smelled like home. My heart pounded harder than it had in years, and when I finally knocked on the door, I realized my hand was trembling. I will never forget the moment it opened. The woman who stood there was unlike anyone I had ever seen. Her dark hair spilled like ink across her shoulders. Her green eyes caught mine with a force that rooted me to the porch, and there was something in the way she carried herself that told me she had faced storms greater than the one I brought with me. Behind her were 4 others, each striking in their own way. They filled that cabin not like intruders, but like they belonged there, like the cabin had been waiting for them. And somehow, they were waiting for me too. I thought at first it must be some mistake, that perhaps they had wandered in after my uncle's death and claimed the place as their own. But then they told me the truth, or at least the first piece of it. Uncle Henry had given them permission to stay. Not in writing that I had seen, but in a contract they produced, signed in his own familiar hand. He had allowed them to live there, to tend the cabin and the land, in exchange for nothing more than keeping the place alive. For years they had done so, quietly, hidden away from the world. My uncle had never told anyone, not even the lawyers, not even me. I wanted to be angry. The cabin was mine by law, and yet everything inside of me knew that these women belonged to it more than I ever could. Still, my blood demanded answers, and when I pressed them, their eyes turned wary, shadowed by a fear that had nothing to do with me. They were not just living here. They were hiding from a man whose name I would soon learn to hate. Morrison. That was the shadow that lingered in every glance they exchanged, the reason their laughter faltered whenever the wind shifted. They never spoke his name that first night, but I could feel him in the tension of their voices, in the way their shoulders tightened at every sound outside. Whoever Morrison was, he had marked these women, and whether I wanted to or not, I had stepped into his path. When I lay down that first night, I did not sleep. The cabin smelled of lavender and wood polish. The beds were neatly kept, the walls sturdy with repairs my uncle could never have made alone. Yet my thoughts were restless. I kept seeing those 5 faces, so different yet bound by something deep and unspoken. I kept hearing the quiet strength in the voice of the green-eyed woman who had first opened the door. And I kept feeling the weight of the deed in my coat pocket, proof that by law this was mine, yet by fate, perhaps, it was never meant to be mine alone. That was the night I realized my inheritance was not a cabin at all. It was a secret. A dangerous one. And secrets like that have a way of changing a man forever. The morning after my arrival, I rose earlier than the sun. The mountains were still cloaked in mist, and the ground sparkled with frost as though the earth itself had been dusted in glass. I stepped outside, half expecting to find silence, to remind myself that everything I had witnessed the night before had been some dream spun by a weary mind. But the cabin was alive. I saw Ruby first. Her fiery hair caught the dim light like embers, and she was already in the corral with 2 horses, her movements confident, practiced. She handled the animals with such ease that they bent to her not out of fear, but respect. I leaned on the fence, watching her for several minutes. Every flick of the reins, every firm word carried the weight of someone who had worked with horses her entire life. There was defiance in the way she moved too, as though every step declared she would never again let the world break her. Near the garden, I found Sadie. She was kneeling among rows of vegetables that had no right to grow so well in such rocky soil. Her small hands worked gently, lifting frost from the leaves, humming a tune I didn't recognize. She looked fragile at first glance, almost too delicate for the rough world we lived in. But as I watched her brush the earth from a sprouting potato with tenderness reserved for something precious, I realized her strength was quieter, hidden beneath gentleness like iron beneath velvet. The cabin door creaked behind me, and Violet emerged. She did not greet me. She simply stood, arms crossed, her dark eyes assessing me the way a hawk studies prey. Of all of them, Violet was the hardest to read. She carried herself with a stillness that was almost unsettling, and I could feel her mind working even in silence. There was no softness in her gaze, no invitation. She measured me, weighed me, and left me uncertain if I was ally or intruder. Grace appeared next, carrying a stack of papers in her arms. Even at that hour, her auburn hair was neatly tied back, her sleeves rolled, her expression calm but focused. She moved with purpose, each step efficient, her eyes flicking between the ledger in her hand and the corral beyond. Grace had the air of someone who carried burdens no one else dared touch, the kind of woman who kept order when the world wanted to descend into chaos. I would come to learn that she was the quiet backbone of everything that happened in that cabin. And then there was Clarabelle. She emerged last, not rushing, not apologizing for her lateness, simply stepping into the morning light as though it had been waiting for her. She didn't need to do much. Her presence alone shifted the air. When her green eyes met mine across the yard, I felt the same pull that had struck me at the door the night before. She carried no papers, no tools, no buckets. Her contribution was different, harder to define. But I saw how the others glanced at her, waiting for her nod, her approval. She was the anchor, the one they looked to when decisions carried weight. I told myself I was simply observing, gathering information about people who had taken over what was rightfully mine. But the truth is, I was captivated. Each woman carried a different kind of strength, and together they formed something I could not quite name. It wasn't just survival. It was something more deliberate, as though they had chosen to build not just shelter, but a life. Still, the question lingered. From what were they running? Later that day, I asked Clarabelle to show me the contract. She led me inside, where the cabin smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine resin. She opened a wooden chest, withdrew a folded paper, and handed it to me with steady hands. My uncle's signature sprawled across the bottom. The terms were simple: residence granted in exchange for care of the property. But what struck me most was the date, signed just 3 months before his death. My uncle had known exactly what he was doing. Why would he hide this from me? From the lawyers? From everyone? That night, as the fire crackled low, I found myself studying their faces by lamplight. Ruby sharpened tools near the hearth, her fiery hair catching every flicker. Sadie mended a torn shirt with careful stitches. Grace sat with her ledger, murmuring figures under her breath. Violet remained in the corner, her eyes on me more often than the page she pretended to read. Clarabelle, though, she watched them all, quiet, thoughtful, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as though she alone carried the weight of truths not yet spoken. I wanted to ask. I wanted to demand answers. But something in their silence kept me from pushing. It wasn't that they were unwilling to speak. It was that they were guarding something, not out of mistrust, but out of fear. And I began to sense a shadow stretching over that cabin. A shadow that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the lives they had lived before I arrived. I remember lying awake again, the deed still in my coat, the contract folded beside it, and realizing that I was caught between two worlds. One belonged to me by law. The other belonged to them by necessity. And in the silence of the mountains, I had to face the truth. If I forced them out, I would not just be evicting squatters. I would be tearing apart something fragile, something that might not survive without protection. What I didn't yet understand was that protection was exactly what they needed. Not from me, not yet, but from a man whose name I had not heard, though his shadow already reached into that cabin like the touch of winter itself. By the third day, I could no longer pretend that curiosity was not eating me alive. I told myself I was simply trying to understand the terms of my inheritance, to determine whether the contract these women held was valid or fraudulent. But the truth was simpler. I needed to know who they were, and more importantly, what they were hiding. The mountains have a way of making silence heavy. Out there, far from town and further still from law or gossip, a man can hear his own heartbeat louder than anything else. But the silence in that cabin was different. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of people listening for something beyond the walls. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind through the trees made them tense in subtle, almost invisible ways. I noticed the way Ruby's eyes would flick to the window when horses echoed in the distance. I saw how Sadie would pause mid-motion, her hands frozen over a bowl or a sewing needle, her breath caught in her throat. Violet never looked startled. Her reaction was sharper, her gaze hardening, her fingers curling like she was preparing herself for a fight no one else wanted. Grace would straighten her back, her jaw tightening, as though bracing for another burden. And Clarabelle's green eyes grew watchful, distant, as if she were measuring the shadows themselves. That was when I realized they were not simply living here. They were waiting. That evening, I sat outside on the porch with a pipe I had not touched in years. The frost had begun to melt from the eaves, dripping steady into the dirt, and the mountains loomed against a blood-red sunset. Clarabelle came to sit beside me, her movements as unhurried as if she had all the time in the world. She didn't ask for permission, didn't offer apologies. She simply sat, close enough that the warmth of her arm brushed mine. For a while, neither of us spoke. When she finally did, her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of stone. She told me there was a man who believed that contracts could bind more than land or property, who used ink and lies the way other men used chains. His name was Morrison. The sound of it chilled me, though I did not yet know why. Clarabelle did not tell me everything. Not then. She spoke carefully, as though each word could cost her more than she could spare. But she gave me enough. Morrison had power, money, and connections that reached into every corner of the territory. He owned judges, bribed marshals, and built a network of fear as sturdy as any fortress. To him, women were not people. They were possessions. And in his mind, these 5 women belonged to him. When she said it, my chest tightened in anger. Clarabelle explained that each of them had once been tied to Morrison through forged debts, coerced contracts, or threats against their families. Ruby had been tricked into signing away years of her labor after her family's farm mysteriously burned to the ground. Sadie had been promised safe passage for her younger brother, only to find herself bound in a contract she never fully understood. Violet had been pursued not for her labor, but for her knowledge. She knew numbers, accounts, and the kind of secrets men like Morrison didn't want made public. Grace, with her keen mind and organizational skills, had been pressed into keeping false records, documents she refused to sign, and for that she had been marked a liability. As for Clarabelle, she did not say. She only looked out over the valley, her expression calm, but her silence thundered louder than words. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I had expected squatters, maybe thieves. What I had inherited instead was a battleground. My uncle had known. He must have. That contract granting them residence. It was not charity. It was protection. He had hidden them away in his mountain cabin, given them time, given them a place to breathe. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was part of that secret. That night, the fire burned low as we sat together in the main room. Ruby sharpened a knife, the scrape of steel against stone harsh in the quiet. Sadie sat near her, staring into the flames with eyes too haunted for her gentle frame. Violet remained in the shadows as always, her gaze fixed on me like she was trying to decide whether I was trustworthy. Grace was writing in her ledger, but I could see her hand tremble when the wind rattled the shutters. Clarabelle sat closest to me, her presence steady, her silence commanding. I tried to imagine walking away. I tried to picture myself riding down that mountain, deed in my pocket, leaving them to whatever fate awaited. But the thought twisted in my gut like a knife. These women were not just victims. They were survivors, fighters. And yet, they had been running for too long. I lay awake again, staring at the rafters above me, the smell of wood smoke heavy in the air. Outside, the trees groaned under the weight of the wind, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled. I thought of Morrison, a man I had never met, but whose shadow stretched all the way to this cabin. I thought of the fear in Sadie's eyes, the defiance in Ruby's, the calculation in Violet's, the quiet burden in Grace's, and the steady strength in Clarabelle's. And I knew that whether or not I had chosen it, I was now tied to them. Morrison had not yet arrived, but his presence was already here, in every corner of that cabin, and I had the sinking feeling that when he finally came, he would not be alone. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet, the kind of quiet that prickles at a man's skin like the static before a storm. I busied myself with repairs on the cabin roof, mending broken shingles, splitting logs for the firewood pile. It gave me something to do with my hands, though it did nothing to settle the churn in my thoughts. The women moved with a new urgency, as though Clarabelle's confession had loosened a hidden knot in all of them. Ruby trained the horses longer, making sure they could handle long rides through rough terrain. Sadie doubled her efforts in the garden, though I noticed her setting aside dried herbs and roots into small cloth bundles, supplies for travel, not for cooking. Violet spent hours hunched over scraps of parchment, copying numbers, making lists she burned as soon as she finished. Grace reorganized every chest, every drawer, labeling and relabeling until the cabin itself felt like a war camp disguised as a home. And Clarabelle, she watched. Always she watched. She never told the others what to do, but somehow her silence guided them all. I began to understand. They were preparing. Not for winter, not for harvest, but for something else. Something coming. It was 2 nights later when the first sign arrived. I had gone down to the creek at dusk to fetch water. The air was sharp with pine and smoke from our chimney, the last streaks of daylight bleeding into purple shadow. I was crouched by the stream when I heard it, the distant clatter of hooves. Slow, measured, not the wild gallop of a rider in haste, but the deliberate rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. My stomach sank. I set down the bucket and crept back toward the ridge, moving low, careful not to break a twig beneath my boots. From behind a cluster of rocks, I saw them, 2 riders emerging from the tree line, their coats long and dust-stained, their hats pulled low. They didn't ride toward the cabin. Not yet. Instead, they paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the land as if smelling the air for secrets. One of them dismounted, crouched, and touched the ground where the women's horses had passed. I could see his hand tracing the fresh prints in the dirt. He muttered something to the other, too far away for me to hear, but I caught the edge of his laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. They lingered only a few minutes before turning back into the woods. But the meaning was clear. They knew. They were close. I returned to the cabin with the water bucket shaking in my hand. When I told them what I'd seen, Ruby swore under her breath, slamming a knife into the table so hard the wood splintered. Sadie paled, clutching the fabric of her dress like a child. Violet's eyes narrowed to slits, though she said nothing, just began pacing. Grace closed her ledger and set it aside with trembling fingers, her lips pressed into a thin line. Clarabelle, however, did not move. She sat perfectly still, her green eyes meeting mine. "Morrison's hounds," she said softly. "He's testing the ground." Her calmness chilled me more than Ruby's fury or Sadie's fear, because in that calmness I heard certainty. This was not speculation. This was a pattern she had lived before. That night, no one slept. Ruby sharpened her knives until sparks flew. Violet stayed near the window, her silhouette sharp against the lamplight, watching the tree lean with a hunter's patience. Sadie prayed quietly, her voice a trembling murmur. Grace organized provisions into sacks, her movements brisk, precise, mechanical. I sat with Clarabelle near the fire, and for the first time I allowed myself to ask the question that had been burning since she spoke Morrison's name. "Why stay?" I said. "Why not run? If he's coming, why wait for him here?" She turned to me, and in the glow of the flames her face was both soft and unyielding. "Because we've been running long enough," she answered, "and there is nowhere left he cannot reach." Her words sank into me like stones into water. I wanted to argue, to insist there must be some place beyond his grasp. But the look in her eyes told me she had already searched, already tried, already bled for that dream. Later, when the fire had burned low and the others had grown quiet, I heard it again, the distant cry of a wolf in the mountains. Only this time, I wasn't sure it was a wolf at all. The next morning, tracks were found near the edge of the clearing. Hoof prints, boot prints, fresh. Morrison's men had been closer than we thought, and as I looked at the 5 women around that breakfast table, their faces pale but set with determination, I realized the truth. This was no longer about property, or inheritance, or contracts signed in ink. This was war. By the 5th dawn after I first saw those riders, the mountain no longer felt like my uncle's land. It felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot. The forest, once alive with bird call and wind in the pines, had grown still, too still, as though every living thing was holding its breath. The women moved with a rhythm that spoke of long practice. They had lived under Morrison's shadow before. I could see it in the way they checked doors twice, in how Ruby never let her knife leave her hand, in the way Violet's eyes flicked toward every window at the faintest sound. Grace counted and recounted supplies with the obsessive care of a soldier rationing powder. Sadie barely spoke at all now, her hands trembling whenever a horse whinnied in the distance. And Clarabelle, always Clarabelle, kept her calm. But I had begun to notice the tension at the corners of her mouth, the steel in her gaze when she thought no one was looking. It was on the 3rd night that the first true warning came. I had been walking the perimeter of the cabin, carrying my rifle, listening to the creak of the timbers and the distant howl of the wind. When I rounded the barn, I stopped cold. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting, their eyes rolling white in the dark. I moved closer, lantern in hand, and then I saw it. The barn door latch had been cut clean through. Not broken, not forced, cut. With precision. Someone had been inside. My chest tightened as I raised the lantern higher. The hay was disturbed, tacks scattered across the floor. But the worst part was what had been left behind, nailed into the wooden post above the trough. A strip of parchment, with 3 words scrawled in heavy black ink. "He is coming." The lantern shook in my grip. My first thought was to tear it down before the women could see it. But even as I reached for it, I stopped. No, better they see. Better we all understood. When I brought the parchment inside, Ruby snatched it from my hand, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might shatter her teeth. She threw it into the fire without a word, the flames devouring the ink until only ash remained. Sadie's lips trembled in silent prayer. Violet whispered something sharp under her breath that I couldn't catch, but the venom in her tone needed no translation. Grace sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her knuckles white. And Clarabelle, her green eyes locked on mine, said in a voice steady as stone, "Then it has begun." From that moment, we stopped pretending. I helped Ruby board up the windows with planks cut from the shed. Violet drew maps of the valley, marking ridges, creeks, and choke points where riders might approach unseen. Grace turned every corner of the cabin into storage, sacks of flour stacked behind chairs, rifles hidden beneath loose boards in the floor. Sadie tended to poultices and bandages, though her hands shook with every knot she tied. And Clarabelle directed it all, not as a commander barking orders, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had already survived worse nights than this. Still, I could feel it pressing down on us, Morrison's presence. He was not here yet, but his men were. Watching. Testing. 2 nights later, the sabotage worsened. We woke to the smell of smoke, the acrid sting burning our throats. Ruby was the first to scream, rushing outside barefoot. The barn was on fire. Flames licked at the walls, crackling with the greedy hunger of dry timber. We formed a line, hauling buckets from the creek, coughing and shouting over the roar. For a terrible moment, I thought we'd lose it all, the horses, the feed, everything. But by dawn, the flames were beaten back, leaving the barn half-charred, the air thick with ash. The horses survived, but just barely. On the blackened doorway, carved into the wood with a knife, was another message. No place is safe. That morning, I found Sadie crying quietly into her hands, her shoulders trembling. Ruby tried to comfort her, though her voice shook with rage. Violet demanded we strike first, her fingers tapping the barrel of her revolver like she longed to put it to use. Grace argued that it would be suicide, that we had to stay hidden, hold ground. Clarabelle silenced them all with a single glance. "They want us afraid," she said. "Fear is their first weapon. Don't hand it to them." But fear was already there. I felt it in my own chest, no matter how tightly I gripped my rifle. That night, as the women finally drifted into restless sleep, I sat awake by the fire, the rifle across my lap, listening to the whisper of the wind. And in that stillness, I swore I heard it, the faintest sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Not close, not far, just near enough to remind me, Morrison's men were out there, watching, waiting, and every hour they lingered, the noose drew tighter. The air in the valley grew heavier with each passing day, as though the mountain itself knew what was coming. Every dawn brought new dread, every dusk a fresh silence that pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing. We worked like soldiers now, not settlers. Violet drilled us on sight lines, making sure every window had a field of fire. Ruby tested blades and rifles until the oil stained her hands black. Grace reorganized the pantry again and again, packing food into small sacks that could be carried in a rush. Sadie prayed more often than she slept, her lips cracked from whispering psalms through the night. And Clarabelle, she moved among us like a still center in the storm. She said little, but her presence was enough to steady us. Yet no matter how ready we pretended to be, none of us were prepared for the night Morrison's men finally showed their faces. It was just past midnight when it began. A crash shattered the silence, the barn door slamming open, the horses screaming in panic. Ruby was already on her feet, knife in hand, before the rest of us had shaken off sleep. Violet dove for her rifle. I grabbed mine from where it leaned by the hearth, my heart thundering against my ribs. Then came the voices. Light it. Burn 'em out. I threw the door open, and the world erupted into chaos. Figures moved in the yard. 3, maybe 4, their faces masked by scarves, torches blazing in their hands. One hurled a torch toward the barn roof, and fire bloomed across the dry thatch like a living serpent. The horses kicked and screamed, shadows thrashing against the firelight. I raised my rifle and fired. The crack split the night, sending one of the men sprawling into the dirt. The others shouted, scattering, but they didn't run. No, they answered back with gunfire. Bullets whistled past, splintering the doorframe, tearing chunks of wood from the cabin walls. Down! Violet shouted, dragging Sadie behind the heavy table we'd tipped for cover. Grace hurled a sack of flour into the firelit yard, and for an instant the air turned to white smoke, blinding one of the riders. Ruby, wild-eyed, charged out with her knife, slicing at the man nearest the barn. He shrieked as steel cut through his arm, stumbling back into the dark. It was chaos, pure, raw chaos. One torch landed on the cabin roof, setting the shingles ablaze. I scrambled up the ladder, heaving water from the barrel to douse it while bullets tore the air around me. Smoke stung my eyes, but I kept throwing water until the flames hissed and died. Below, Violet fired shot after shot, her face grim, calm, every bullet finding its mark. By the time the gunfire ceased, 2 of Morrison's men lay bleeding in the dirt. The others fled back into the trees, their torches abandoned, their shouts fading into the night. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of dying flames and the labored breath of the horses. We had survived. Barely. Inside, the women gathered in silence. Sadie wept openly, her hands covering her face. Ruby paced like a caged wolf, her knife still slick with blood. Violet methodically reloaded her rifle, each motion precise, her jaw clenched. Grace pressed a cloth to a shallow graze on her arm, her face pale but steady. And Clarabelle simply sat, her green eyes fixed on the door as though waiting for it to burst open again. Finally, she spoke. This was only the beginning, she said. No one argued. At dawn, we buried the bodies far from the cabin, near the edge of the creek. Violet wanted to leave them for the wolves, but Clarabelle insisted otherwise. Dead men speak, she said quietly, and Morrison will hear what they say. We said no prayers, only worked in grim silence, shovels biting into frozen earth. When it was done, Ruby drove a stake into the ground above their graves, a mark not of respect, but of warning. Back at the cabin, the damage was worse than I'd realized. The barn roof was half-burned, the doors splintered. Bullet holes riddled the walls. Smoke had blackened the rafters inside. Grace began repairs immediately, her hands moving with mechanical determination. Sadie tended the horses, whispering to them as if her voice alone could calm their terror. Violet kept watch on the ridge, her rifle never leaving her side. Ruby sharpened her knife until sparks flew, her lips pressed in a hard line. But the truth weighed on us all. Morrison would not stop. If anything, this first attack meant he was closer, testing, measuring, waiting for the moment to strike in full. That night, as I lay awake staring at the smoke-stained ceiling, I realized something with a chill that sank deep into my bones. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress. And a fortress is only built for one purpose: war. The valley felt different after the attack. The air itself carried a weight, a watchfulness, as though the mountain knew the lines had been drawn. Smoke scars still blackened the barn roof. Bullet holes pocked the cabin walls, crude reminders that the enemy had crossed from whispers into flesh and blood. We tried to settle back into routine, but there was no routine anymore. Every task carried the tension of waiting. Hauling water from the creek meant scanning the tree line every other step. Chopping would meant gripping the axe as though it might have to split bone instead of pine. Even eating felt unnatural, the scrape of forks on tin plates loud enough to betray our position to whatever ears might be listening. And always, there was the silence of the forest. Too still. Too patient. It was on the 7th morning after the raid that I saw him. I was on watch, perched at the ridge above the cabin, rifle across my knees. The sun was just climbing over the pines, burning away the night's mist. That was when a figure rode into view at the far end of the valley. Alone. He moved slow, deliberate, as though he owned every inch of the ground his horse's hooves touched. His coat was black, long, its hem brushing the dust. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but I could feel his eyes even from a distance. He rode with the calm assurance of a man who feared nothing and expected less. Morrison. There was no mistaking him. I raised my rifle, heart hammering. One shot. I could end it here. One shot, and maybe this nightmare would be over. But then he stopped. Not at rifle's reach, but farther. Just far enough that the wind carried his presence, his silence, but not his life into my hands. He dismounted slowly, tied his horse to a dead pine, and stood with the stillness of a stone. Then, without lifting his head, he raised his right hand and beckoned. Not a threat. Not a shout. Just a gesture. An invitation. I didn't go down. Not at first. But soon Clarabelle appeared in the yard below, green eyes locked on the dark figure across the valley. Ruby followed, knife already drawn. Violet came with her rifle. Grace and Sadie lingered at the doorway, fear carved plain across their faces. Clarabelle's voice carried up to me, calm and certain. Come down. If it's Morrison, we face him together. Reluctantly, I obeyed. We approached as a group, stopping well before he could close the distance. He lifted his head then, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. Weathered. Hard. The kind of face that had seen too much killing to remember any other life. His eyes were pale grey, cold as the steel at his belt. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Too quiet for a man who had come with fire and blood. You've cost me men. The words hung in the morning air, simple as a knife. Ruby snarled. Your men came to burn us alive. Morrison didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on Clarabelle. You've hidden well, he said. But you know how this ends. It always ends the same. Clarabelle's jaw tightened, but her voice did not waver. Not this time. For the first time, Morrison's mouth curved. Not into a smile, but into something colder, sharper, a shadow of amusement. You've forgotten who I am. He spread his arms slightly, the coat shifting like the wings of a crow. I don't take. I consume. Everything. everyone, until nothing remains but me. He took a single step closer. Instinctively, I raised my rifle, but Clarabelle's hand shot out, stopping me. Morrison's eyes flicked toward the motion, and for a brief instant I thought I saw the faintest spark of respect, or perhaps curiosity. "You have 7 days," he said softly. "Surrender what is mine, or I'll take it all, piece by piece." He turned then, slow and deliberate, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the horizon without another word. The silence he left behind was worse than the gunfire. Back at the cabin, the women argued. Ruby wanted to hunt him down before he struck again. Violet said we should fortify harder, set traps, prepare for siege. Grace argued for retreat, her hands shaking as she spoke. "We can't win against him, not with so few." Sadie wept, begging them all to stop, her voice cracking like dry wood. But Clarabelle stood apart, staring out the window toward the path where Morrison had vanished. Her eyes were not afraid. They were calculating. "Finally," she said, "we have 7 days. Then the valley burns. Unless we burn first." And in that moment, I realized what she meant. We weren't just defending anymore. We were going to have to strike back. The 7 days Morrison promised did not pass quietly. The first morning after his warning, the valley felt poisoned. Every rustle of wind through the pines sounded like footsteps. Every crack of branch beneath a deer's hoof felt like the snap of a rifle bolt being drawn back. The forest had always been a place of shelter, a wall between us and the world. Now it felt like an accomplice, hiding Morrison's men in its shadows, carrying their whispers straight to our door. We did not waste time. Morrison had spoken clearly, and none of us believed his threat idle. Clarabelle gathered us by the hearth, the smoke from the chimney curling above like a signal none of us wanted to send. "We can't wait for him to come," she said. "If we do, we're dead." Her words cut through the fear like steel. Ruby slammed her knife into the wooden table, the point quivering. "Then we take the fight to him." Violet's eyes flicked up from her rifle. "First we find where he's hiding." Grace swallowed hard. "If we leave the cabin, we might not come back." Clarabelle didn't flinch. "If we stay, we won't." So we began to prepare. Violet drew maps of the valley, marking streams, cliffs, and narrow passes. She knew the land better than any of us, and under her guidance, the forest became more than a place of fear. It became a weapon. Ruby fashioned traps from spare iron and rope, the kind meant to snap bone and spill blood. She set them in hidden gullies and along paths she knew Morrison's men would take. Watching her work was like watching a wolf bare its teeth, efficient, merciless, certain. Grace turned her fear into purpose. She packed food into small satchels, stitched blankets into cloaks that could blend with the brush, even fashioned crude bandages from torn sheets. Her hands trembled as she worked, but her determination never faltered. Sadie prayed, but she also learned. Violet forced a rifle into her hands, guiding her through the motions again and again until her shots no longer missed the tree trunks she aimed at. Each shot echoed in the valley, a small defiance against the silence. And Clarabelle, she planned, always watching, always listening, as though she could hear Morrison's footsteps on the wind. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. On the 3rd night, we scouted. The moon hung low, shrouded by clouds, giving us cover as we slipped into the trees. My rifle felt heavier than ever, each step through the underbrush too loud in my ears. Ruby led, crouched low, knife at her belt. Violet followed, silent as shadow. Clarabelle walked just behind, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. It wasn't long before we saw the first signs of them. A half-burned fire pit near the creek. Boot prints pressed deep into the mud. And then, voices. We dropped flat, pressing into the brush. Just ahead, in a clearing, 3 men huddled around a low fire. Morrison's men. Their rifles leaned against a log, and their laughter carried sharp and ugly in the night. I could see it then, their ease, their arrogance. They weren't afraid. They thought us prey hiding in a cabin, waiting for the butcher's knife. Ruby's fingers twitched toward her blade. Her eyes gleamed with hunger for blood. But Clarabelle shook her head once. "Not yet," she whispered. So we waited, watching, learning. The men spoke of Morrison, of how he had promised them the valley, the horses, even the women. My blood ran hot at their words, but I kept still. When they finally doused the fire and drifted toward sleep, Clarabelle leaned close, her voice barely a breath. "Now we know. He camps by the creek. Not far. Not hidden." We slipped back through the forest, every step heavy with new purpose. The next days were spent weaving the valley into a snare. Violet strung lines of bells from old tin cans, hidden among branches, so that any movement would sing a warning. Ruby coated her blades in ash to keep them from glinting in the sun. Grace laid out packs near the cabin door, ready for flight or fight at a moment's notice. But it wasn't just preparation. Something was changing in us. Sadie no longer trembled when she held her rifle. Ruby began to smile again, not with mirth, but with anticipation. Violet carried herself with sharper confidence, her voice steadier than before. Even Grace, pale and quiet, began to speak of what we could do rather than what we might lose. And Clarabelle, her eyes burned brighter every day. "We're not waiting for him," she said one night, as firelight flickered across her face. "We're hunting him." For the first time, I believed her. On the 7th dawn since Morrison's warning, we stood at the ridge overlooking the creek. Smoke curled from the enemy camp, faint but steady. We could see them moving among the trees, shadows bending to their will. This was it. The choice no longer belonged to Morrison. The valley was about to become a battlefield. And for the first time since he rode into our lives, I felt something other than fear. I felt ready. The morning fog hung low in the valley, a grey shroud that made every tree trunk a potential hiding place and every shadow a threat. We moved silently, each of us carrying weapons, knives, or traps we had spent days preparing. The creek, where Morrison had made his camp, lay ahead, a narrow bend in the valley where the trees thinned, offering sight lines but little cover. Clarabelle led, moving like a shadow herself. I followed closely, rifle raised, scanning the brush. Ruby flanked the right side, eyes sharp, every sense attuned to danger. Violet stayed slightly behind, keeping the left flank secure, her rifle already aimed at any movement in the mist. Grace and Sadie trailed, carrying supplies and medical packs, ready for whatever came next. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A twig snapped, too sharp a crack for the soft damp of morning. Ruby froze, eyes narrowing. Violet leveled her rifle toward the sound. I swallowed hard, aware that each heartbeat might be my last in the valley that had become our home. And then the attack came. 3 men burst from the brush, rifles raised, shouting, unaware that every step carried them straight into our carefully prepared snares. Bells clanged in the trees, warning us, giving us the split-second advantage we needed. Ruby leapt forward, knife flashing, cutting one of the men across the arm. He fell, shrieking, just as a wire trap snapped tight around another, yanking him to the ground. Violet's rifle barked, and a man went down with a thud into the muddy creek bank. Clarabelle moved like a predator, stepping from shadow to shadow, her revolver precise and devastating. The battle had begun. Bullets hissed past me, splintering branches and embedding in the mud. My rifle cracked, the report echoing across the valley. Morrison's men fought with desperation, their arrogance shattered by our precision. They had thought the cabin was an easy prize, that the women inside were weak, untrained. They had underestimated us. Ruby moved like a storm, her movements fluid, every strike lethal. She cut through 2 men before one lunged, grabbing her from behind. She struggled, but a sharp whistle from Clarabelle distracted the attacker, and Ruby twisted free, knife plunging with deadly efficiency. Violet crouched, firing with calculated calm, her eyes scanning every corner. Each shot found its mark. Every man who thought he could approach our home fell to the ground or cried out in pain. Grace stayed close to Sadie, directing them to positions where they could help but not be overwhelmed. Her calm authority kept the chaos from consuming us entirely. She patched wounds on the fly, handing Sadie bandages and clean water while whispering instructions under fire. Even the creek itself became a weapon. Fallen branches, tied with wire, created barriers, tripping attackers into the mud. Morrison's men found themselves fighting not just us, but the land itself, guided by our intimate knowledge of every slope, every hidden path. Then came the warning sign. From the ridge above, I saw movement, more riders. Morrison himself was coming. His black coat a shadow in the morning fog, his pale eyes fixed on the chaos below. He carried no rifle, only a pistol and the certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. Clarabelle saw it too. She signaled with a hand, and we shifted positions, turning our defense into a deadly ambush. Ruby laid in wait behind a fallen log. Violet moved higher, rifle ready. Grace and Sadie kept behind the trees, their makeshift barricades ready. Morrison rode into the clearing, slow, deliberate, as though he were examining us rather than attacking. And yet, every man in his command who remained alive followed his lead, stepping into our trap without suspicion. The trap was perfect. Ropes snapped, nets fell from trees, mud pits swallowed horses, and every rifle shot found its mark. Morrison's men scattered, confusion and panic turning the once organized force into chaos. But Morrison himself was untouched. His cold eyes scanned the valley, and then they locked on Clarabelle. The air shifted. The battle, which had been a blur of violence and instinct, became personal. Every fiber of my being screamed to protect her. Morrison dismounted, pistol drawn, advancing toward the woman who had orchestrated this counterstrike with calm precision. I raised my revolver, heart hammering. Ruby and Violet flanked, knives and rifles at the ready. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the fog pressing close as if watching the final act unfold. Morrison's voice cut through the morning, smooth, deadly calm. "You think you can defy me? This ends today." Clarabelle stepped forward, steady, unflinching. The pistol in her hand matched the determination in her eyes. "No," she said simply. "This ends when we say it does." And in that moment, the valley became a battlefield not just of survival, but of will, of control, and of truth. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the valley in full. Every tree, every stone, every shadow seemed alive with anticipation. The clearing around the creek was littered with the aftermath of traps, fallen enemies, and disrupted horses. Morrison's men, the few who had survived the ambush, lay scattered or fled into the trees. But Morrison himself remained, standing near the edge of the creek, revolver in hand, pale eyes scanning the carnage with a predator's patience. I tightened my grip on my rifle, heart hammering, sweat chilling against the early morning breeze. The women moved with precision beside me, each a master of her own weapon and instincts. Ruby's red hair shone like fire in the sunlight, her knife ready. Violet's rifle stayed trained on any movement that might spell danger. Grace and Sadie flanked our position, ready to provide support or heal if needed. And Clarabelle. Clarabelle was the eye of the storm, her revolver pointed steadily at Morrison, her green eyes calculating, fearless, almost luminous in the pale light. He took a slow step forward, each movement measured, calm, methodical. A man who knew he could kill, who had believed all life bent to his will. "You've made a mistake," Morrison said, voice calm but sharp as broken glass. "You think the valley belongs to you. You think the women here are free." Clarabelle didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving his. "They've always been free. And now, so is this land. You miscalculated." He let a small, cruel smile creep across his face. "Freedom is a luxury, one that dies quickly when power comes knocking." I felt the weight of the moment press down on my shoulders. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to end this man before he killed more, before he shattered the valley we had fought to protect. But Clarabelle raised a hand, and I froze. She didn't need words. We all understood. This was her fight, as much as ours. Morrison's hand twitched over his pistol. He was calculating trajectories, assessing risk, weighing the chances. But he didn't fire. Not yet. He wanted us to panic, to move first, to give him the upper hand. Ruby's knife glinted as she shifted her stance. "You'll regret underestimating us," she muttered, voice low but full of lethal promise. Clarabelle took a step closer, revolver leveled, voice steady, commanding. "This ends now, Morrison. Every threat you've made, every life you've tried to control, every lie you've built, it's over." The tension stretched like a taut wire across the valley. Then Morrison's mouth twisted into a sneer. He raised his pistol. A single shot. Before he could fire, a deafening roar echoed through the valley. Horses thundered from the ridge, riders in lawman uniforms, badges glinting. Marshal Thompson had arrived. Morrison froze, recognition crossing his face, pale skin paling further. He was trapped. The ambushes, the valley's traps, the women's precision, and now the law, all converging like an unstoppable force. Morrison's eyes darted from the approaching deputies to us, realization dawning. He had underestimated the network, the strategy, the loyalty, and the courage of the 5 women and the man who had once been a stranger in their lives. Clarabelle stepped fully into the open, revolver aimed steadily. "It's over," she repeated, voice echoing across the valley, carrying authority and undeniable truth. Morrison's body tensed. He glanced at the few remaining men under his command. Fear was creeping into their eyes, the same fear we had felt in the early days, the fear that comes when you realize you've lost control, that the world isn't yours to bend anymore. "You're finished," I said, voice carrying more conviction than I knew I had. "All of you. You can't control people. You can't own land. And you won't harm these women." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun again, desperation replacing arrogance. But a sharp whistle from Clarabelle, and the marshal's deputies were on him in an instant, disarming him with coordinated precision. Morrison struggled, fury etched into every line of his face, but it was futile. The weight of his crimes, the evidence collected by the women, and the strategy we had executed left him no escape. He went down hard, bound and defeated. His network of terror collapsed around him. The valley was silent again, the mist clearing to reveal not ruin, but survival, hard-won, earned with skill, courage, and relentless determination. We gathered together, the women and I, surveying the damage, the signs of the struggle etched into the land and the forest. Yet for the first time in weeks, there was relief. Triumph, not just over Morrison, but over fear, uncertainty, and the dark power he had once wielded over the valley. Clarabelle stepped beside me, hand brushing against mine, a silent acknowledgement of what we had accomplished. "It's done," she said softly, voice warm with emotion beneath the iron resolve. Ruby, Violet, Grace, and Sadie moved closer, their faces showing exhaustion but also pride. The women had faced threats they never asked for and had emerged victorious, stronger than any of us had imagined. And in that moment, as the valley breathed again, I realized that what we had built together was more than survival. It was family, trust, loyalty, and the fierce promise that no one could ever threaten our freedom again. The valley was quiet now, the sun climbing higher and burning away the last traces of fog. Morrison's men were rounded up, the evidence collected by the women placed securely in the hands of Marshal Thompson and his deputies. The defeated man himself was escorted to the lawmen's horses, his pale eyes flicking over the valley he had tried to dominate. He no longer had the arrogance, only the hollow certainty that justice, in whatever form it came, had found him. We returned to the cabin together. The structure stood firm, scarred but resilient, a symbol of what had been fought for and what had been earned. Clarabelle moved beside me, her hand brushing mine casually at first, then more intentionally, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had endured and accomplished together. Ruby, Violet, Grace, and Sadie followed, their presence a living testament to survival, resilience, and unity. Inside, the cabin was warm. Fires had been rekindled, and the smell of wood and lavender filled the air once again. Clarabelle and I exchanged a long look, one that needed no words to express what we both felt: respect, admiration, and something far deeper that had grown through fire, struggle, and unwavering trust. Ruby, ever the restless spirit, moved to the corral, checking on the horses with a sense of purpose that reminded me how much life still waited outside these walls. Violet and Sadie set about repairing the minor damage done to the garden and fencing, their movements fluid, their minds already planning for the months ahead. Grace carefully catalogued supplies and documents, her quiet leadership keeping the group organized and focused, even in the aftermath of chaos. Clarabelle finally turned fully to me, her green eyes holding mine. "You've grown," she said softly, "not just in courage, but in understanding what it means to protect, to lead, and to care." I swallowed, realizing how much the past weeks had changed me. The quiet man who had arrived at this cabin, expecting solitude and inheritance, was gone. In his place stood someone who understood responsibility, loyalty, and the strength of connection. I nodded, voice low but steady. "And I couldn't have done it without all of you. Not without you." A sense of calm settled over the cabin as the women moved about, resuming their routines. The valley itself seemed to exhale, the tension of weeks of fear and violence finally lifting. The battles we had fought were now behind us, but the bonds forged in the fires of adversity remained, unbreakable. Over the next days, the valley transformed again, not through conflict, but through hope and rebuilding. Morrison's hold was broken, and the cabin, once a place of solitude and inheritance, became a true home for 5 extraordinary women and a man who had learned what it meant to belong. Gardens flourished, horses grazed peacefully, and the cabin's walls echoed not with fear or tension, but with laughter, warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of a hard-won peace. And as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, I stood on the porch, Clarabelle beside me, and realized the truth that had become clear over the past weeks. The inheritance my uncle left me wasn't just a cabin or land. It was the chance to become part of something far greater, a family forged by courage, trust, and love. We could handle anything together, every challenge, every threat. Morrison's shadow was gone, but the strength we had found in each other remained eternal. I smiled at Clarabelle, feeling a warmth and certainty that had been absent from my life until now. "Perhaps," I said quietly, "we've been handling each other all along." Clarabelle laughed softly, a sound bright and full of life. "Perhaps," she agreed. "And that's exactly how it should be." As night fell over the valley, the cabin stood proud, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary lives of the 5 women who had turned my world upside down in the best possible way. I had arrived expecting inheritance, but I had found something infinitely greater: purpose, family, and a life worth protecting. And for the first time, I understood that the quiet life I had once imagined would have been empty compared to this, surrounded by people who challenged me, trusted me, and loved me in ways I could never have anticipated. The past, the dangers, the battles, they had all led to this moment of clarity, peace, and connection. We were free, the valley was ours, and the story that had begun with inheritance had ended with something far more meaningful: the discovery of what it truly meant to belong.